Welcome everyone to the CSPC 2022 pre-conference sessions. We'll be starting off with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you all from Montreal, which is on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. I encourage you to all learn more about the land and Indigenous peoples for the places that you are joining us from. So this is the second short talk session, which will feature 5 short talks from a range of interesting subjects and accomplished speakers. Each talk will be around 8 minutes of presentation, followed by 2 to 3 minutes of questions. I request you all to submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I also encourage you to upvote any of the preferred questions. So we'll be starting off with our first presentation. We have Dr. Bronwyn Hancock from UConn University and Alexa Reedman from ArcticNet.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. Are the slides on screen? So thank you to CSPC for hosting us. My name's Alexa Reedman. I'm the Research and Partnerships Manager for ArcticNet, and I'm pleased to be presenting alongside my colleague, Dr. Bronwyn Hancock, who's the Associate Vice President Research at UConn University. So I'm going to start off just with a quick overview of what ArcticNet is, how the North by North program came to be, and Bronwyn's going to get into some more of the specifics, and then what it's like from a Northern institution perspective. So ArcticNet has existed since 2004 as a network of centers of excellence. We bring together scientists, engineers, managers in the social, natural, and health sciences, and we work with Indigenous organizations, Northern communities, and government agencies. Our focus is really on the development and dissemination of knowledge around adaptation strategies and policies to help Canadians face the impacts and opportunities of climate and socioeconomic change in the Arctic. So on screen, you'll see the map. We've got all of our study sites from 2004, as well as the institutions and organizations we work with, and the tracks of the icebreaker and research vessel Amundsen that a lot of our marine projects partner with. Then next slide, please. So the next slide is a bit of an added glance of where ArcticNet currently is and a lot of the groups that we currently work with. And I'm not sure how aware everybody on this call is, Northern research wasn't always managed or implemented in the most ethical way. And there's been a lot of lessons that we've learned since 2004, and we've constantly adapted the network. So you'll see one thing we're very proud of is we focused a lot in the past few years on EDI, and you'll notice the gender breakdown of our project leaders is now essentially even. But the other element was really focusing on getting how we can work appropriately with and for the North. And that's how North by North came to be. So it's making sure that Northern communities and Indigenous peoples aren't subjects of research, nor are they observers of research, but they are actually researchers and project leaders. And that's how North by North came about. So the North by North program has 2 sub-programs. Bronwyn will get into some of the specifics. The first is called the Inuit Kawisagnimut Pilorjutit, which is Inuktitut for Inuit Research Program, and the other component is called the Northern Research Leaders Program. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Bronwyn.
Thank you, Alexa. We can move to the next slide, please, and I'll just say good morning from snowy Whitehorse. I'm on the traditional territories of the Kwamandun and Tonquitchan councils, but UConn University has campuses on the traditional territories of all 14 First Nations. And it's really been a pleasure for us to work with Alexa and the ArcticNet team to co-develop the North by North program. We wanted to bring it here to you to demonstrate the real success that this deeply co-developed, partnered, and sort of co-conceived program has had, you know, those deep successes and the impact it's had for the partner organizations that are Northern based. So I'm representing our partner group coming in from Yukon University. So we really worked with ArcticNet to co-create the vision of this program. Like Alexa mentioned, as ArcticNet moved through its evolution as a research program, they really wanted to grow their partnerships with Northern organizations and Indigenous groups to support self-determination in research and to support the advancement of research led from that perspective by Northern organizations. And really did a lot of work to create space for us to co-create that North by North program with ArcticNet. So next slide, please. We'll show you a little bit about how the program is constructed. We've got, as Alexa mentioned, the Inuit Research Knowledge Program, IQP, as one branch of the North by North program. This portion of the program funds project-based activities. Alexa will talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. And then the Northern Research Leaders Program funds regional programs that each of the partners have developed. So we've, under the Northern Research Leaders Program, have developed programs out of Yukon University, Aurora Research Institute as part of Aurora College, Nunavut Arctic College, and then out of the Labrador campus of Memorial University. And they have really been regionally specific programs that each of the regions have developed to be responsive to the needs that they have. You'll see some of the stats there. These have been quite impactful. They've engaged a lot of Northerners in leading research projects across the territory. Across territories and the northern regions, I should say. I'll pass it back to Alexa for the next slide to talk about the IQP program in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Bronwyn. So on the next slide, you'll see the IQP is the first and only Inuit-led, directed, and governed research program in the world, and it implements the 5 priority areas of the National Inuit Strategy on Research, which we refer to as the NICER. So one of the fundamental things about how the IQP was developed and is implemented is that it is truly driven by the regional Inuit organizations. So those are the 4 land claims organizations of, you'll see them there, Nunavut Tungavik Inc., the Nunatsiavut Government, the Makivik Corporation, which 2 days ago did just change its name to just be Makivik with 2 V's. So this was not updated in time, just making a note of that, and the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation. So those 4 entities are the decision-making bodies that are in our peer review committee, and then Nathan Obed, the president of ITK, and Lisa Koperkwalik, the president of ICC Canada, sit on the ArcticNet board. So the way that we've designed it is that the program fully weaves into our entire governance structure to ensure that there is Inuit decision-making, leadership, and governance at all levels. And with that, I'll pass it back to Bronwyn because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions.
Great, thank you. So I'll tell you quickly about the Northern Research Leaders Program, and then we'll end talking a little bit about perspectives from us as Northern partner institutions around how what this program has meant for us and how it has influenced our research. So on the next slide, we provide a summary of what the Northern Research Leaders Program focuses on. When ArcticNet engaged with the Northern organizations that are listed here, we told them we know what we want to work on in our region, and we are able to draw in good money to support activities. What we're really challenged by is the ability to attract and retain funds to pay the people who do the work. We really wanted to use this program to invest in capacity in the Northern institutions to develop Northern research leadership in the areas that we identified were important in our region. So you can see the range of activities that each institution has developed. And we've gone about building that capacity in different ways. At Yukon University, we've invested in some research leadership positions and some research support positions. Aurora College has taken a similar approach. Nunavut Arctic College has focused in large part on an institutional case study and on some work around community-based oral history and Inuit knowledge, recognizing that that's a key part of regional capacity. And then Labrador campus has had a number of initiatives to support the way that they build their program. So on the next slide, I just want to talk really quickly in my last minute or so about what this has meant for us. The thing that worked so well is that ArcticNet gave the Inuit and Northern partner organizations space and time to have very iterative, very long conversations about what we needed this program to be. And I'm sure at times that was really frustrating for ArcticNet because we've got a lot going on. We weren't always the fastest to respond. We took a lot of conversation for us to build a program that worked for everyone, that responded to regional needs. And they were very patient in us in that process. And that, they had to hold some risk on our behalf as we co-developed that program, but they stood up and did that. And that for us was a foundational shift in the way that we funded research programs. So it's meant that we've really been able to draw a place-based perspective. ArcticNet has worked hard to build administrative pathways that support our funding program. And really key to this is that throughout, we have created shared governance models that feed into ArcticNet's governance structure that have seats for all of the partners who've been part of the creation of the program. So those have been really key in our sense that we're being heard, that we're being recognized, and that we're building programs that are really responsive to institutional needs and to demonstrating Northern research leadership under the program. We will wrap there, but are happy to take questions in our remaining minute.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful presentation. If there are any questions, I request you to please put them in the Q&A chat box. In the meantime, do any of our other speakers have questions? Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
If anyone in the audience will attend the ArcticNet annual science meeting in Toronto, you'll get to hear some of the research activities that this program has been funding over the last 3 or 4 years and meet some of the research leaders. So please, if you're there, say hi to us and feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. December 4th to 8th in Toronto.
Yes.
So we have a question from the chat box. Is there scalability in this model?
It's a good question, and it's one that we're asked quite frequently. So we're in the process right now of developing relationships with some of the other Northern Indigenous nations to see about building similar programs, but it really depends on what they want, and that's kind of the nuance of the program, is that you have to take a distinctions-based approach, and that means approaching each group regionally and as how they want things to be. So it's not really possible to just take this model and apply it across the country. It's pretty specific to the North, but even then, between different Northern nations, there's different cultures, different approaches. So it's not easily scalable, and a lot of it is very much relationship based, and it takes a very long time to build trust.
But I will comment that some of the principles that underpin the program, that the one that gave us time to build the program together, that had the major funder accepting some of the risk of program development, and that allowed us to really build regionally specific programs, are certainly principles that can be applied on a different scale, geographically, size-wise, budget-wise.
Thank you. We have another question. How does ArcticNet align with the Global Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs?
Well, that's a pretty major question. Thanks, everyone. I would say that this isn't the only program that we fund. I would say that all of our programs and projects align with different sustainable development goals in different ways. That's something that we ask when people are applying for funds, is not only how are you addressing issues of national importance, but of global importance. So a lot of our linkages are through the importance of helping Canadians respond to and face the impacts of climate and socioeconomic change in the Arctic. I can give you a much more detailed answer, but I feel that's going to be like a 2-pager that I can put together for you later if you'd like to reach out to me by email.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, and thank you to the audience for your questions. We'll move on to our next presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Lauren Tracy from the Canadian Association for Graduate Studies.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you to talk about this topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. This was work I did as a graduate student, and it was a really collaborative effort with another intern who worked on this project, Annalisa Chrysosimo, along with our mentor, Jonathan Turner from the University of Toronto, and our sponsor, Ian Worley, who's the executive director at the Canadian Association for Graduate Studies. So just a brief outline. I'm going to talk about the background to the project, touch a little bit on the study, and I'm going to try and spend the most time on just the discussion and our recommendations. And of course, I'll spend some time on acknowledgements. So briefly, our work was built off of a really nice study that was completed in 2016 from the Canadian Association of Graduate Studies, or CAGS. This was thanks to support from the Tri-Council that gave funding for this project. And CAGS, along with the Graduate Professional Development Network, or GPDN, surveyed 42 institutions across Canada to create a catalog of graduate professional development programs, or GPDPs. So the goal of this project was twofold. First, to just document the climate of graduate student GPDPs in Canadian universities, and also to provide guidance on best practices so that other universities could create and or improve the activities happening at their own institutions related to graduate professional development. So the 2016 iteration of this project did produce several valuable resources, which are highlighted here. However, it came with a number of limitations and shortcomings, including a failure to capture nuances in programming, such as different organizational structures, programming geared toward equity deserving groups, information on programming for postdoctoral fellows, and specific design and assessment methods, including gaps and challenges for guiding frameworks and theories. So the current project is a reiteration of this 2016 study, but with some key areas included to overcome the limitations from the first study. So these are namely examining EDI practices and programming geared toward equity deserving groups, documenting postdoctoral fellow programming, identifying collaborative efforts through internal and external partnerships, and approaches to design and, importantly, assessment, which has been historically very difficult to do with these kind of programs. Now, over the course of this survey, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and so we decided to expand the survey to include some information on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on professional development programming, as well as the sort of gap in skills between what trainees are prepared for and what employers are expecting trainees to be prepared for. So our project AIM had three goals. Firstly, to facilitate data collection and distribution that's meaningful, informative, and fully captures the institutional strengths as well as areas for improvement across the country. Secondly, to support industry leaders, benchmark best practices and innovation by really obtaining a comprehensive view of the graduate and postdoctoral development programs across Canada. And thirdly, to update the catalog of graduate and postdoctoral development programming and create an online resource that's searchable and can be updated over time so that this can grow as graduate and postdoctoral development programs grow. So the survey development process was very much a consultative strategy. We incorporated feedback from many different steering committee members that are leaders in this field, as well as other specialists. We consulted French administrators to help with translation to make sure that the jargon matched up between both versions of the survey. We also received Research Ethics Board approval for the study. And again, we consulted many leaders and were able to receive additional Tri-Council support and funding, which we're grateful for. Just an overview of the progress that we've made. This was again significantly disrupted. We started in early 2020. We've now finished the data analytics. We've generated a detailed written report. And the final step, which should be done by the end of this month, is putting all the data online into this repository that's searchable. So just an overview of the responses that we were able to get. We had really good engagement with the survey. So we received 54 responses from 36 different universities across Canada, 3 different research institutions, and 13 program partners. So these were sort of sub programs within the universities that really helped us map the complexities of these development programs. So in the last couple minutes, I will just go through some of the observations and recommendations that we have. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through the actual data. So firstly, we really believe that this report and online repository will be an invaluable tool for benchmarking all aspects of graduate and postdoctoral development programs, or GPDPs. And so this will allow people to compare and contrast to similar institutions to theirs, and it allowed us to really highlight some best practices that are happening across our nation. Secondly, our results show that partnerships as part of GPDPs are a really transformative best practice in their ability to both reach more participants and customize the content based on the needs at the time or the needs of the students. And thirdly, both CAGs and GPDN, who are these national nonprofits aimed at promoting professional development, are really ideally positioned to help institutions scale their local successes at the national level. Our survey also highlighted that more and better data is needed on these programs. We think this work is a really great foundation for future work, but we recognize that more data will help to know who GPDPs are and are not serving. It will help administrators advocate for the right distribution of resources as well. We also wanted to highlight some examples of best practices in access and inclusion models for systemic institutional changes that can be leveraged by GPDPs, which we're already starting to see reflected in our data, such as the calls to actions from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Scarborough Charter as examples. So lastly, our survey showed how GPDPs are really ideally suited to support graduate and postdoctoral fellows with labor market transitions, and how large of a focus this has really become in these development programs across the country. And finally, it's clear that GPDPs are doing really outstanding work and innovative work, really coast to coast. And they've had to be really nimble in their approaches with things like online learning so abruptly becoming the norm. So it's clear to us that the more resources these programs have and the more people they're able to serve, this could really increase the transformative impact of these programs. So with that, I would just like to thank the number of people who provided invaluable support to us, our steering committee, the University of Toronto, and some other stakeholders who provided valuable insight, our funding sources. We're very grateful, as well as our institutional sponsors here. And with that, I really encourage you to send us an email if you have any questions. The cags.ca website is the host of the report and the online repository if you want to check it out. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Lauren. We do have one question in the chat. Mm-hmm. When looking at PD, was the relevance or need-based PD evaluated? Also, how do you think this has changed through the pandemic?
Was the relevance or need-based? I'm honestly not sure if I understand the first part of the question. I can address the second one if you don't mind, maybe just clarifying. But this has definitely changed throughout the pandemic, and it was something we really wanted to capture. Unfortunately, the timing of our survey was what we would call mid-pandemic, so we ended up releasing it in the spring of 2021. So at that point, people had gone through a full year of kind of online programming, and we're just starting to imagine going forward and what that would look like. So we kind of got a snapshot of snapshot in time, really, of how things were starting to change. And so mostly what our data was showing was things like the way in which programming was delivered and the participation. So that definitely changed. I see there's a clarification, so I'll just read it. Is it need-based professional development or just all available professional development? There are a lot of opportunities, but not all are directly relevant to helping graduate students. So, so really what we tried to evaluate in our study was, it was quite a long survey that we asked these administrators to fill out. And we tried to capture as much as we possibly could. That was one of the main goals of the survey. So a lot of the questions were asking things like, how do you determine the programming that you're going to give? So what methods are you using to actually assess the needs of students? And so we were capturing all available professional development, but we were also capturing, the methods in which the programs were designed to capture what the needs are of the students. So yeah, it's a good point. And I think to your second point about there are a lot of opportunities, but maybe not directly relevant. We focused a lot on how administrators are assessing the outcomes of their programming as well, and how that's feeding back into the design of their program, because that's a really key part. You really need a sort of continuous improvement model as times are changing, as resources are changing, as the job market is changing. So that was a really key part of our survey that we tried to highlight.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the questions, and thank you, Lauren, for that really great presentation. We'll be moving on to our next presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Steve Wilson from Ecologic Research.
Thanks very much. Just share my screen here. Start my presentation. Okay, we're up. Great. So thanks very much. Delighted to be here, joining you from Gulf Islands in British Columbia, traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Tom Nuds and Andrew DeVries, and also our funding partners, Tolko Industries, through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta, as well as the Forest Products Association of Canada. And where I'd like to start is with some familiar territory for questions that have arisen from health-related research. Things like, if higher education correlates with lower rates of diabetes, will providing more education necessarily reduce diabetes? If moderate wine drinking correlates with better health, should we be telling people they should drink moderately? If consumption of sugary drinks correlates with obesity, should we be taxing such drinks to reduce obesity? And what's common amongst all these policy questions in the health field is that in each case, the evidence for a treatment effect is correlational, because definitive experiments to establish cause and effect relationships couldn't be conducted. And that's generally because of logistical or ethical constraints. And of course, why is this a problem? As scientists, we know that without experimental evidence, which is the gold standard for establishing cause and effect, it's very difficult to establish what is actually causing something else. Yet, when we're talking about policy interventions, we have to assume such a relationship, regardless of whether that experimental evidence exists or not. And as ecologists, we work in a discipline that is largely, although far from exclusively, based on observational rather than experimental evidence. And this isn't necessarily fatal, because of course many scientific disciplines are by necessity either entirely observational or partly observational. So we think of something like astronomy or paleontology. Obviously you can't do experiments in those fields, but of course those disciplines rarely make policy recommendations to intervene in the system. Now, that used to be true of ecology as well. If we go back a long time, of course, what we were doing was mostly observational. If you think of the traditional naturalists with a notebook, but of course the world is changing, and conservation is moving up society's hierarchy of needs for a variety of reasons, but certainly driven by issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, fires, ever increasing demands for resources by a growing human population. And as a result, the policy implications of management recommendations by conservation biologists are becoming much more consequential. And nowhere is this more obvious than in Canada's approach to boreal caribou recovery. Many of you are probably maybe familiar with this issue, which shows up in the newspaper every once in a while. Caribou have been in decline for Canada for decades, as have their reindeer cousins in Eurasia. Obviously a key issue for Canada's Indigenous peoples and Métis and Inuit. And this is, and the Canada's recovery strategy is very aggressive and lays out some very significant actions. Recovery actions are going to cover 2.4 million square kilometers of boreal forest, and the opportunity costs are quite enormous on what's actually being proposed. And this easily makes conservation of caribou in Canada the most expensive attempted conservation project ever. Maybe not even just in this country, maybe in the world. It dwarfs such other famous issues like, say, the recovery of spotted owl in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest of the US, or even the closure of the cod fishery in terms of the scales of impacts we're talking about. That is dwarfed by something like this. And so based on that, we'd better have a good idea what we're doing, except that most of our evidence for this ambitious program still comes from simple correlations of measuring human-related footprint and evidence of caribou declines. And so that's a problem because as was stated by Judea Pearl in a somewhat provocative way, I see no greater impediment to scientific progress than the prevailing practice of focusing all of our mathematical resources on probabilistic and statistical inferences, while leaving causal considerations to the mercy of intuition and good judgment. And what that means and how that manifests itself is that in the method sections of many of our papers now, we have extremely detailed statistical methods. And where we spend a lot of time analyzing the correlational structures of our data in a very objective way, but relatively little space is dedicated to justifying the subjective decisions that carry the implicit causal implications, such as which variables to include and exclude. How could they be causally related? And we believe these subjective details should figure much more prominently in the method sections of these papers. And more broadly, anyone interested in evidence-based policy, those on the call who may not be working in this conservation field, but anyone interested in such things should be thinking about this issue. Are your policy recommendations coming from an analysis of past events rather than experimental evidence? If so, this is relevant to you. And for many years now, we've been advocating the methods of causal inference, which is a set of tools used to estimate causal effects from observational data based on a set of strong assumptions and identification rules. And these strong assumptions are encoded in causal graphs, which map the hypothesized relationships amongst various factors leading from treatment to outcome. And then there's an associated calculus to determine whether those causal effects can be identified given the structure of the graph, and then determine the strength of those relationships if the data are available. So this is a graph, a simplified graph of what we use in the caribou world, where our outcome on the right is this caribou population trend. And you can see that there's a number of pathways that we need to diagnose using tools of causal inference to figure out what exactly is going on, where the strengths are, and where we can intervene in the system to generate the highest benefit for the least cost, basically. And the method is not without controversy, because to find a true causal effect requires knowledge of a true causal graph. And we're not omniscient, so we can never actually know what the true causal graph is. However, by stressing that our causal claims are only valid within the model under consideration, that's okay. And then it's up to the research to defend the theory that went into the development of that graph. And while still imperfect, we argue that this at least forces transparency about assumptions and generates some testable consequences. And I think it's also important to note that while research must defend the theory, the sources of that theory need not be exclusively scientific. So cause and effect is a very intuitive, cross-cultural concept, and causal models can be based on broad evidence and experience while maintaining rigor. Therefore, we think that this can contribute positively, these kinds of approaches can contribute positively to Canada's reconciliation efforts with Indigenous people, because it gives us an opportunity to blend evidence within a shared ethical space. Now, The other thing that's in the news quite a bit is deep learning AI methods. We hear about that all the time in the news. And the question is, well, is that playing a role here? Is that some way that we could get at these issues of cause and effect from observational data? And it's important to note that to date, basically all machine learning algorithms are just very sophisticated pattern matching routines, but they encode actually no causal information. So you could, for instance, develop a deep neural net to predict with great precision whether when a rooster will crow in the morning in relation to the sunrise, for instance. But based solely on data, there's no way for that machine to determine whether the sunrise causes the rooster to crow or whether a crowing rooster causes the sunrise. And if prompted for a management recommendation, that machine is likely to suggest to you that you should kill the rooster to prevent the sunrise. And humans, of course, immediately recognize that as an absurd conclusion, but it's not at all obvious to a machine armed only with the data. And it's for that reason that we need to augment our analyses of correlational structures with theory. And our recommendation is that causal assumptions need to be explicit and part of the analytical pipeline whenever we're dealing with recommendations, policy recommendations that are being derived from primarily observational data. And again, not just in conservation, but we would suggest everywhere. And we think that this will lead to a much stronger this will lead to stronger inferences and therefore far more reliable management recommendations. So I'm going to wrap up here with this great image of the church of the 95% confidence interval. It's a stats joke. They're hard to find, but it's just to remind me and everyone on the call that while we should be evangelizing evidence-based policy, regardless of our discipline, policy recommendations that are based primarily on observational evidence need to meet a higher standard than is generally currently being enforced. And that higher standard should include the development of and robust defense of hypothesized causal structures and associated predictions of effect sizes and the likelihood of desired outcomes. So I'll stop there. If you'd like to read more, we published an article on this a few years ago. I encourage you to download and take a look. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Steve. If we have any questions, I request you all to please put them in the Q&A chat box. We just have a request to share the link for the paper that you mentioned.
Would you like me to put that in the chat?
Yeah, that would be
at some
great.
point. I'll do that after,
Yeah.
after I talk. That's great.
Thank you. We have one question here. How do your recommendations align with Canada's commitments under the CBD and the IG 2010 targets?
CBD, Conservation Convention on Biological Diversity. I think it's a methodological approach, and I think that the alignment is very good and highlights the need for tools like this. Again, when we're working on these very large landscapes, multiple use landscapes, we have a lot of things going on, and we just can't develop large randomized experiments and perturb systems, for instance, that where we have biodiversity concerns. So if we're dealing with already compromised landscapes, we don't want to put them at further risk by subjecting them to some sort of intervention that could be damaging. So I think it's methods like this that help us meet those goals by giving us a better chance of parsing out the cause and effect relationships and being efficient with the interventions that we're certainly going to have to increasingly make as we find ourselves in the current biodiversity crisis.
Thank you so much. We have another question. How would you report your findings to policymakers working on these issues?
Yeah, I think that one of the main things is that because we rely quite a bit on graph theory, I find that it works quite well. It scales from primary researchers who can get into the numbers and the math behind the graphs, but the graphs themselves actually are very intuitive. And I've used them successfully in executive briefings for senior levels of government, Many people have used them in First Nations consultations. They seem to be broadly applicable, and because we have a method that can scale from the primary researchers to really the general public and stakeholders and First Nations, it provides us a leg up on good communications.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you so much for all the questions. We will now move on to our next presentation. Our next speaker is Monica Granados from Creative Commons.
Thank you so much. I want to talk to you today a little bit about the OpenClimate Campaign, which we launched in August with the purpose of making the open sharing of climate change and biodiversity research the norm. So what's the present state? Open sharing of research outputs is not the default. If you were to look at all the publications that are produced by US authors, about 41% of those are open access, and that's very sort of broad open access. So, that may involve publisher provided or author provided. If you were to look at all of the publications from Canadian authors, about 38% of those are open access. So if you want to go and read research from Canadian authors or American authors, it's likely that you're going to end up hitting a paywall, meaning that if you want to get access to that research, you either have to be associated with an institution that pays a subscription for you to access that information, or you don't get access to that. I work for a nonprofit now. I hit paywalls every day and can't have access even to sometimes, papers from my colleagues. However, something interesting happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The research community responded differently. There's a reason why most research is not open, and that's because incentives are really driving researchers to specific practices like publishing behind a paywall and keeping their data close, because they're incentivized to do those practices, because that is the currency that is used to assess them, and it may mean whether they get a job or a promotion. So you really understand that behavior. So what was different with COVID-19? I think it was really, there was a recognition that this was different. This was a different problem. This was something that was affecting every individual on the planet. And that for us to really understand what was happening, what COVID-19 was, how it was spreading, we needed to know more about the virus. And so we see that reflected, that change in practices reflected in things like the number of papers that are open access that are COVID-19 related. So taking a snapshot from 2021, about 71% of COVID-19 related papers are open access. Now contrast that to 41 and 38% of all papers from these two countries. There was also a really big adoption of preprints. So researchers across disciplines, but especially in the biomedical sciences, recognize that the scholarly communication process, so from your writing up of your manuscript and submitting it to a journal and undergoing peer review and several iterations of peer review to that final version, can be a very long process, from 6 to a year to sometimes 2 years or even more, depending on the paper. That is a long time to wait when you're in the middle of an epidemic, of a global crisis. And so information needed to go out quickly. So researchers responded by using preprints. So uploading a version of their manuscript that has not gone through peer review, but putting their data and information in a sort of formatted manuscript available for people to review. And this all is really showing that we needed to have information for this problem that was affecting the entire world. A recognition that if we're going to solve the world's greatest problems, the knowledge about them needs to be open. And so what greater problem that the world is facing than climate change? It's one of the world's most pressing problems, and very much like COVID-19, has the possibility to affect every human on the planet and probably every aspect of our lives, and exacerbate already existing inequality. So the OpenClimate Campaign recognizes this need to have access to knowledge in order for us to solve the world's greatest problems. There was already an allusion to, or a mention of the Global Sustainable Development Goals. Climate change is one of them. For these large problems, we need to have access to that knowledge. And climate change, we recognize, is a complicated process, a complicated problem to solve, and that we are saying this might not solve climate change, but it's a necessary condition for us to be able to generate solutions and mitigation and adaptations. So the OpenClimate Campaign has come up with 11 goals to promote research, to access to research to accelerate the progress towards solving the climate crisis and preserving global biodiversity. It's a project, Creative Commons, where I'm based, Spark, and Eiffel. The OpenClimate Campaign's 11 goals are campaign messaging. So going and talking about the OpenClimate Campaign, getting some information about where are we in terms of open access for climate change and biodiversity publications. Are we close to 77%? I think early indications show that we're about at 47%, 41% for climate change publications. So nowhere near COVID-19 publications that are, tackling or trying to generate solutions to an equally large problem. We want to know what are some legal and policy barriers that are preventing the adoption of open practices and the adoption of open access across different institutions and governments and environmental organizations. And then we're actually going to work with those governments, funders, and environmental organizations to create open access policies that address those policy barriers, that help work within those frameworks that exist in different countries and funding organizations and environmental organizations to create open access policies that do incentivize the practices of open sharing of research. We want to make sure we work to include open access language and open practices international frameworks like the Convention on Biological Diversity that has come up already today as well. We want to work with collaborators. So we want to secure endorsements from environmental organizations, from research institutions, from universities, from ministries, anyone who is interested in working with us and highlighting the need to make this incredibly important research that is working on one of the world's greatest challenge be open. We also want to make sure that this is not a global North campaign. So much of open scholarship has had a global North perspective, and we want to ensure that this campaign also includes traditionally excluded voices in open knowledge. And 10 and 11 really look at past publications. So from 1 to 9, we're looking at in the future how these policies are going to change future publications. But what about past publications? What about legacy publications? What about those publications that are cited in IPCC reports? Are those open? Let's get a corpus of those fundamental key, highly cited publications and ensure that that corpus is completely open and accessible to scientists, to policymakers, to anyone who is interested in taking that knowledge and mobilizing it towards developing solutions to climate change. And so we just started the campaign. We have a great website the Open Climate Campaign. It's openclimatecampaign.org. That's our email. That is our Twitter. You'll find action kits specifically designed for researchers or national governments or funders that say, detail what you could do to move towards open sharing of research, and also how the Open Climate Campaign can help. We're here to develop policies. We're here to help you open up your educational resources. We're here to give advice on Creative Commons licenses. More information on our website, and you can always contact us through that email.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Monica. If there are any questions, I request you to please put them in the Q&A chat box. How do you think reward structures in academia could be altered to promote open data? And what role do funding agencies have to play?
Yeah, I think this is a problem that needs to be worked on in parallel. So I think it happens at the funding agency level, but also at the specific institution level. So the funding agency comes up with the rubric of how they designate who gets an award and who doesn't get an award. The institution decides who gets the job or who gets the tenure or not. You come up with this. This is not it's a construct. You can change that construct. If you want to incentivize practices that make your research more accessible to the public and policymakers and anyone who it's the moral imperative to share knowledge, then change those incentive structures by giving metaphorical points in that assessment process to open practices. And you just need to decide to do it.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions from other speakers for Monica?
Yeah, I've got a question, Monica. Great talk, Monica. I've been caught on this myself because I use publicly available data sets from governments. And unfortunately, many of those data sets are used under a restricted license, and I can't share the data.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then we also get caught. So that's number one. I think there's a big barrier there where governments are very conservative around their sharing practices in terms of basic data sets. And the other problem, of course, is that there's got to be a way to collapse some of the cost around this stuff, because as noted, the Canadian public, especially for researchers in universities, we pay for, we subsidize the salaries of the researchers, we pay through the granting agencies for the researchers, and then we also have to pay for them to publish. And a lot of that money, it's cost probably $5,000 to publish an open access paper these days. Most of that publishing is international, and so it's money going out of the country. And it seems to me that we have a very strong publishing legacy with Canadian journals, and I think the granting agencies, by collapsing the costs around that and encouraging research that Canadians fund to be published without that cost, I think would be a huge step towards incentivizing people to make their research more available.
Yeah, certainly. I think both of those points, both the data and sort of the publications part, is also sort of an absence of knowing best practices and what resources are available. Most data really can't be copyrighted. So you shouldn't be putting restrictive licenses. They should be in the public domain, except for, of course, sensitive data, which is sort of a different category. So some of that is also like the Open Climate Campaign, going and talking to governments and saying, hey, this is probably the better practice for X, Y, and Z reasons. In terms of, I do think the consolidation really hits to the point of diamond open access. And that's something that we are really behind here at Creative Commons and at the Open Climate Campaign. It's this idea that we should be providing open access, but with no article processing charges. But we do that by moving the money around, right? So instead of spending money on these subscriptions, what if we just had our own journals? Like you said, there's so many strong publishers, like the Canadian Science Press, I think, nonprofit publisher. We have the infrastructure, we have the money. We just need to consolidate that so that we're not moving towards moving money to commercial publishers necessarily.
Thank you so much. We have one more question if that can be answered quickly. Could you provide any insight into the role of the campaign with supporting a broader implementation of open science at all levels, such as academia, government, and NGOs?
Yeah, so one of the things that we want to do is so we're going to work with specific funders, governments, and environmental organizations, but we also sort of want to serve as sort of this hub, a connection. We've got a lot of really great people involved in the campaign. And so what we want to do is, like, if you're a researcher, if you're an institution that wants to bring in open practices and you need the training, we'll connect you with people who are providing that training, like, organizations that dedicate themselves to training researchers, places like OpenScapes or Open Life Sciences. These are two nonprofit organizations that do that. So reach out to us if you have questions, we can connect you. That's part of our mandate as well.
Thank you so much, Monica, for the lovely presentation. And thank you so much to all the questions. We will be moving to the next presentation. So our next speaker is Sandra Code Bay from Ingenium.
Thank you. So I'm going to be sharing my presentation. It should be on screen shortly. And I'd like to introduce myself. I am Sandra Code Bay. I do work for Ingenium, which is Canada's National Museums of Science and Innovation. My role there is to work on strategic partnerships and networks. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Cayenne-Cayuga people. I'm near the Ottawa River, from my home. And I'm really pleased to be part of this short talk today to talk to you about something that's very important to my work and our work at Ingenium, and that's looking at Canadians' science identity and helping to build a way to diversify engagement and work on trust in science. I feel like there's a connection to what I'm saying, what I've been saying to our other speakers. I use she, her pronouns, and for those of you who'd like a description of me, I am wearing glasses, joining you from a rather cluttered office full of knickknacks and things on the shelf. I'm wearing my hair up, and I'm wearing a poppy proudly that was given to me from a friend in Iqaluit, which is made of seal fur. The reason I want to talk to you about science identity is that it's really important for a lot of the work that we've done. And I feel like we're at a crossroads where we're sort of needing to re-examine our traditional ways of looking at a person's relationship with science identity. I'd like to acknowledge that what I'm presenting to you is the result of a lot of research by others, and that I'm sort of synthesizing some ideas that have been shared by researchers, but mostly outside of Canada. And so what Ingenium's really looking at is trying to take a look at these paradigms, take a look at these frameworks, and see if they're in any way useful to us here, given anything that's specific or unique to our country. And if not, how we can adjust that. And so I'm going to also take this opportunity to invite any of you on the talk today listening. If you want to know more, because this is a short talk, don't hesitate to reach out, because we are in the midst of something rather exciting, and we are trying to include others in our work. Why does this matter, you might wonder? It matters because science, as you've heard from many of the talks today, I feel like I'm well placed amongst people who are already believing this. Science is really fundamental to the critical global challenges ahead. The UN declared this year the International Year of Basic Science for Sustainability. And we need to make sure people are feeling a part or included or in the science tent, as we say. I will tell you that when I say science, I often use it interchangeably with STEM, because of course Ingenium has a mandate to work on science, technology, engineering, and math. Science was part of our mandate, but of course we now sort of fold those all together. And as we're looking at that, we need to consider a person's belief, their culture, their science equity, and that might not be a term that you're familiar with. So the previous slide that I showed was possibly one that can help you see that someone's equity is a composition of what they know, how they think, who they know, and what they do. And it really is not a reductive process. It's not looking at what they don't have. It's really looking at what they already possess and trying to take someone's science identity as a launch point. You know, some studies have shown that Canadians only believe science if it aligns with their personal beliefs, and that they believe it more when it comes from a trusted source like a family or friend. And do they have people who understand science in their circles? There's a lot of skepticism out there. There's a lot of worry. The pandemic has increased some people's anxiety about trust, and trusted sources of science continue to need to garner that trust. It's not something you can take for granted. So museums and science centers figure prominently amongst trust, better than some journalistic sources, better than some governments. And so we have an interesting position at Ingenium in that we need to be very careful with that reputation and that trust, but also we can leverage it to sort of help people with their science relationship. And so we're trying to look at these frameworks so that we can diversify engagement and support for trust in science. And that is work that we're doing with a number of contacts and partners and community groups. We really feel like this is the sector-wide conversation that we want to have. And so we're trying to build a bridge between what some people perceive of as science and society. And some of those bridges are there. They may not be strong. They may not bridge out to every community. And the tools and framework that we're working on should help us improve our practice. And this really ties into equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility. If you've heard of Science Capital, which is a framework that was developed by Dr. Louise Archer in the UK, it is part of our research and it's part of our foundation, but we're moving beyond that to look at something a little bit more in the equity area. So we're trying to build a better bridge. So the bridges are there, but we want to build a better bridge. So how can we diversify engagement and support in trust? Well, we need to adopt more equitable approaches, and that's really what's at the core of our work. You've probably heard of or seen these illustrations before where we use different strategies to try to help people access and connect with and be a part of an experience or a topic or an idea. And we're really looking at justice or liberation, so trying to get to the ultimate, which is having that be a part of their lives and not something separate from them. And so sometimes we do have to have different approaches, but we also have to take a look at what we're doing in order to remove barriers where there are barriers. So what does this equitable approach look like for us? Well, we know that we have a past approach that sort of defined the relationship that people had with science as a deficit model. So we often simplified it as science literacy, but science equity is science literacy and more. And so we really want to take a look at who they know, what they know, their definition of science, where science occurs in their culture and in their lives, and not use that deficit model, which is not helping us achieve those EDIA objectives. So at Ingenium, we're going places, we're trying to develop this, but we recognize this isn't just for Ingenium, it's for our sector. So we're doing some research, taking a look at what research is out there. We hope to conduct unique research. We hope to sort of do a review of what's out there. We're having tons of conversations, and there are some folks here that I may have had a conversation with. There may be some people on this call that I want to have a conversation with. And we're going to be doing some roundtable consultations and conversations in the coming months. So if you want to be a part of this, if you think that you have a unique perspective to help us build a better framework, or if you'd like to be a part of what comes out of this so that that framework can serve your work, we want you to be a part of our journey. And so our course is really defining that gap. We're taking a look at the current relationship. We're working on key consultations. We are consulting right now with equity deserving groups researchers, universities, networks. And we are trying to make sure that when we have those roundtable conversations that we have a nice diverse representation and the right people are at the table. And so in a way, today is an invitation to you to reach out to me if you want to be a part of that. The framework development will follow, and it may very well be inspired by existing frameworks, but I suspect that it will have some nuances that are specific to us. So at Ingenium, we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, EDIA, but we also loop into there our objectives around truth and reconciliation. And so we often say, instead of EDIA, we say TREDIA. And so our next steps, and I'm trying to advance my slides, and for some reason they're not wanting to advance. There we go. So our next steps are to invite you, if you have any questions today or after today, you can reach out to me. There's my email. I'm very happy to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing and how we can fold you in or let you know how we're doing, give you an update in a few months, and maybe include you in some of those upcoming conversations.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that presentation. We do have a question in the chat box. Why do you think that the deficit model is still so prevalent when trust and values have been shown to be so important in science learning and engagement?
That's an excellent question. I think that organizations like museums, and I think organizations like formal education systems are very hard to change their practices. It's a little bit difficult to sort of overturn decades worth of practice. And science literacy is pretty easy to assess. So if we're looking at assessment, we get into some very difficult ways of assessing when you include the many elements of something like science capital, which includes, trust and your community and who you know. So I think it's just easier. And I think that there may not be as much awareness of this science capital model. It is coming to Canada, but it is not very well known. So I think the short answer is that it's easier and it's a known system, and we need to help people see that there are some perhaps qualitative assessments that aren't as beautiful in terms of data or metrics when we talk about STEM equity, but they are more informative and will result in higher levels of engagement.
Thank you so much. If there are any other questions, I request you to please put them in the Q&A chat box. Or if any of our other speakers have questions for Sandra, I request you to just unmute and ask your question. We just have a question about connecting with you via LinkedIn if they're interested in participating.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn, and so please reach out that way. Absolutely. Or my email, which is my first initial last name @ingeniumcanada.org. I'm happy to hear if anyone would like to join in.
Thank you. We have another question. The word equity has meanings that are not always seen as overlapping, capital versus justice. How are they overlapping here for you as science equity?
Good question. So the concept of science capital, which is that Louise Archer research that has been going for, I think, about 14 years in the UK, and there's lots of papers around it, was our sort of dipping our toe into this conversation. And as we consulted with certain groups, we realized that the word capital was a little triggering for some groups, especially for some of our Indigenous communities, because it feels quite extractive and it's exploitative and maybe associated with colonialism. And the truth is that the UK practitioners of science capital are moving towards STEM equity. And so I think the the reason that the word equity works for us and the interpretation of equity is a little bit like you might consider having equity in your investments. It's something that you've invested in and that you have already, and it's part of you. You own that, and that you can build on your equity to increase something within yourself. And so, you know, I don't know that equity and capital and justice are entirely linked, but I think they can be pathways. So STEM equity can be a pathway towards justice, and capital is a subset in my mind, or an inspiration or a foundation of our STEM equity concept. Hopefully that answers your question, Tony.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you for that lovely presentation, and thank you so much for all the questions. We do have a short poll for feedback, which we'll be launching now, so please fill that out before exiting the session. So this was our second short talk session. Thank you so much for attending. I would like to thank all of the amazing speakers for their time and their presentations. We encourage you to stay tuned for future pre-conference events and check the CSPC website and social media for details. Thank you so much and have a lovely rest of your day.